McAllister, thank you for your time.
It's a pleasure.
Now, you're quite passionate about retirement outcomes for women in particular, but why should they specifically be isolated in this retirement income review?
Well, we know we've got a problem with women and retirement incomes. So women are retiring with just over half the superannuation balances as men, and the consequence of that is that we're seeing greater and greater numbers of older women homeless and in poverty. It's really just not fair. Like, it's a basic fairness proposition, and it comes about because the retirement income system imagines that a person works full-time all their life. But in fact, the experience for women is quite different. Women are much more likely to take time out of work. They're much more likely to work part-time because they have some caring obligations. And frankly, they also work in lower paid jobs, in lower paid industries. And even if they are in a high paid job, they're often being paid less than the man that they're sitting next to. And all of those things add up to mean that women just don't have the same retirement savings at the end of their lives as men do. And it's a structural problem in the system that needs to be fixed.
Is this a problem, though, where we should be looking at their retirement, or should we be looking at getting more women into higher paying roles, getting them out of this idea that they should be going into carer roles, which do traditionally make less money?
There's actually a big suite of measures that you could take to fix the problem, and they range from dealing with women's incomes to dealing with the specific aspects of the super system to looking at the aged pension. And there's a perfect opportunity to do that right now. The government has announced a review into the retirement income system, but just inexplicably there is no mention of women in the terms of reference. And this week there was a big group of really high-powered people, senior women in business, senior women in the trade union movement, senior women in finance, all saying this ought to be a priority for the retirement incomes review. They've written to Josh Frydenberg asking him to do that. Labor supports that call. This is a huge opportunity. It's a great opportunity to actually deal with this problem and get some serious recommendations on the table and have the government implement them. I think the government needs to move on this. They've sat on it and done nothing for too long, and it's time for a bit of action.
Now, if we look at some of the issues that have dominated Parliament this week, we had a special Labor caucus meeting yesterday about these free trade agreements. Presumably, if you're part of the left faction, you voted against them?
Well, I generally don't talk about what happened in caucus, but you're right that we had a meeting and we've taken the decision to support the agreements. And it's worth setting up two things. The first is that we did that on balance because our fundamental obligation is to grow the economy and to make sure that people who want jobs can get jobs. And we do think that these agreements offer opportunities for Australian businesses to grow. They allow sort of participants in the agriculture sector, the resource sector, the education sector to export to countries like Indonesia, build their businesses, and we think that'll be a good thing for Australians. But they're not perfect, these agreements. They're not the agreements we would have negotiated had we been in government. And we face the situation where we don't really get the chance to amend them from opposition. We can vote them up or vote them down. So we acknowledge that there are actually quite a number of problems with the agreements. We've written to the government about those problems. But on balance, we think they ought to proceed because of the opportunity for Australian workers.
Are the problems the same ones that the union leaders are saying? We've had Michael O'Connor from CFMMEU this morning very passionate about the fact he thinks Anthony Albanese is ignoring the unions on this.
I think the main issue from my perspective is the lack of protection for migrant workers. So these agreements imagine that Indonesian workers may come to Australia, that we'd issue more visas. And the challenge is that we've seen so many reports of migrant workers on working holiday visas being exploited. There are plenty of opportunities for government to address that through the industrial relations system and to make sure that people on working holiday visas aren't being treated badly by their employers. And that's one of the things that Labor is seeking to secure from the government, commitments about protecting people on working holiday visas and also making sure that they're only doing work that they are qualified to perform.
Do you support the idea that a Hong Kong free trade agreement should have a caveat that it wouldn't last if there was further interference from Beijing in Hong Kong?
We're very concerned about the situation in Hong Kong, and we've obviously been calling publicly for parties to come back to the negotiating table in Hong Kong. I think it's hard to imagine all future scenarios about what might unfold there, but we're very clear that protection of human rights and the rule of law in Hong Kong is an important objective for Labor, and we agree with the Government of Australia also.
Do you think that should be part of the free trade agreement though?
As I said, I think it's hard to imagine how to structure those kinds of agreements in that way, but as a first principles, we do support the agreement because of their significance for jobs and also for our kind of partners with our neighbours in the region.
Do you think that it is hypocritical of the government, though, to be seeking an agreement like that with Hong Kong looking to profit greatly when there are these ongoing concerns?
I think we'd like to see the situation in Hong Kong resolved. And we'd like to see it resolved in a way that is peaceful. This agreement, as I understand it, has been ongoing, the negotiations, for a long period of time. We'd hope that those, I think hypotheticals about what might happen in the future are difficult for governments to deal with, but of course, you know, it's open to Australia to take any steps that we might wish to take diplomatically should things change between Hong Kong and the PRC.
Absolutely. And just finally, the economy's been the big discussion this week in Question Time. Labor's really been pushing this point, saying that the government should be up for a debate. But is this hypocritical for the Labor Party to be going after the government on the economy when a lot of your reform measures would have had a really big impact on the budget, on the economy, if you'd won government?
The government did win the election, and they are now in a situation where the IMF, the Reserve Bank, commentators, sections of industry are all blowing the whistle on a big problem emerging in the economy. They do need to take responsibility for resolving it, and attacking the Labor Party is not an answer. It's not a plan for governing. I do think that the Prime Minister needs to think about this a little more carefully, because what he's presenting at the moment is always, given a choice between governing and game playing, he is always choosing game playing. And that's just not going to cut it. And it's dangerous in circumstances where we have so many warnings about the need for a change in approach to economic policy.